Here's something that happens to almost every new investor, and hardly anyone warns you about it beforehand. A year goes by, maybe two, and you finally check your account. The number staring back is underwhelming. You've contributed faithfully every month, done everything the way you were supposed to, and the balance barely looked different from what you put in. So naturally, you start wondering if this whole compounding thing is overhyped. Maybe it works for other people. Maybe you're missing something. You're not missing anything. You're just early. A huge amount of time has gone into understanding why people abandon investing at precisely the wrong moment, which, oddly enough, is almost always right before things get interesting. It's rarely because they lost money or the market crashed. They quit because nothing appeared to be happening, and staying committed to something boring is genuinely hard. Here's the truth, though. Compounding isn't slow. It's patient. And there's an exact identifiable point in the math where patience turns into aggression, where the growth curve stops looking like a gentle slope and starts looking like a wall. Most people never witness it because they walk away during the flat stretch that comes right before it. So today, let's break down what that flat stretch is really doing beneath the surface, why it feels sluggish, even though it isn't, and what happens the instant everything flips. Once you understand this, a quiet, uneventful year in your portfolio will never look the same again. Let's start with why compounding feels so slow. Because the reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Your brain is built for addition, not multiplication. Think about a paycheck. It shows up as a fixed amount and adds to your balance in a straight line, $10 plus 10 plus 10. Your brain handles that kind of growth intuitively without effort. But compounding doesn't add. It multiplies. And human intuition is notoriously bad at grasping multiplication stretched out over time. There's a classic thought experiment finance people love to bring up. Fold a sheet of paper in half 50 times. How thick would it end up? Most people guess a few inches, maybe a foot if they're feeling daring. The real answer is a stack thick enough to reach the sun. Not close to it, past it. That's not a trick. It's simply what multiplication does once you give it enough repetitions. Your portfolio behaves the exact same way, just slower and far quieter, which is exactly what makes it so easy to underestimate. Here's a grounded example. Say someone starts setting aside $400 a month in a retirement account. After year one, they've contributed $4,800, and growth has tacked on maybe a couple $100. Feels like nothing. After year three, they've put in more than $14,000. Growth has added roughly $1,500. Still unimpressive next to the effort involved. The contributions are obviously doing all the heavy lifting. Growth is just tagging along. And if you judged compounding purely on those first 3 years, you'd conclude it doesn't really work. That's the trap, because compounding isn't underperforming during that stretch. It's loading. The base simply has to grow large enough before multiplication has anything meaningful to act on. Here's a mistake people make constantly. Comparing their portfolio's dollar growth to their own contributions month after month, and using that comparison to judge whether investing is working. Early on, contributions will always win that race. Always. That's not a signal to bail. That's just what the first 3 or 4 years of a long game look like. So if the early years are just loading, when does it actually flip? Call this the crossover point, and it's more concrete than most people expect. The crossover point is the moment your portfolio's investment growth for a given year becomes larger than the amount you personally contributed that year. Not your total balance, but annual growth versus annual contribution. That's the real marker, because that's the moment the machine you built starts outworking you. Let's put numbers on it. Same person, $400 a month, $4,800 a year, invested in an account earning around 7% annually, a reasonable long-run assumption for a diversified stock portfolio. In year one, contributions total $4,800. Growth adds a few hundred. But roll the clock forward. By somewhere around year 11 or 12, the balance has grown large enough that 7% of it finally exceeds $4,800. That's the crossover. The year the portfolio quietly starts pulling more weight than the person does. And here's the part that catches people off guard. After crossover, the gap doesn't stay small. It widens, and it keeps widening, because growth compounds on an ever larger base, while contributions typically stay flat or rise only modestly with raises. By year 20, a single year's growth might be double what's being contributed. By year 25, it might be 5 or 6 times as much. The portfolio has essentially hired itself an extra income stream that never takes a day off, never asks for a raise, and works while you sleep. This is also why financial advisors sound almost repetitive about starting early. It isn't a lecture on discipline, it's math. Someone who starts 10 years earlier doesn't just get 10 extra years of contributions. They get 10 extra years positioned ahead of the crossover point, which drags their entire crossover forward and makes the eventual acceleration dramatically bigger by the time they retire. There's another detail that tends to surprise people once they sit with it. Reaching the crossover point sooner doesn't mainly require bigger contributions. It mostly requires time and a reasonable, consistent rate of return. Sure, raising your monthly contribution gets you there a bit faster, but the biggest lever by far is simply not interrupting the process. Every pause, cashing out during a downturn, skipping a few months during a lean stretch, stopping entirely for a year while you sort things out, doesn't just cost you that pause. It pushes your crossover further out, because the base loses uninterrupted time to build on itself. Let's make this concrete with a real comparison, because numbers land better with two actual people to picture. Person A starts investing at 25, putting away $300 a month consistently for 40 years until age 65. Total contributed $144,000. Person B waits, life happens, for whatever reason, and doesn't start until 35. To catch up, they contribute more aggressively, $450 a month for 30 years. Total contributed $162,000. Notice that person B actually puts in more of their own money. Assume both earn that same reasonable 7% average return. Person A, despite contributing less overall, ends up with a portfolio worth roughly $700,000 more than person B by age 65. Not slightly more, hundreds of thousands more, from someone who put in less cash out of pocket. Why? Because person A's early contributions had 10 extra years sitting on the far side of their own crossover point, compounding right through the stretch where growth starts dwarfing contributions. Person B's money never gets those 10 years back. You can replace missed dollars. You cannot replace missed years. Now, it's worth being careful here because some of you started later, and this shouldn't feel like a door slamming shut. Person B still ends up wealthy and still retires comfortably. The point isn't that you're doomed if you didn't begin at 25. The point is that the flat, boring, unimpressive-looking early years are actually the most valuable years in the entire process, precisely because they're the furthest from the finish line, which gives them the most time left to multiply. If you're sitting in that flat stretch right now, you're not behind, you're planting. There's a quieter lesson buried in person B's story, too. The fact that they still built a genuinely strong retirement, despite starting a decade late, isn't an accident. It's proof that the second best time to start is always right now. Every additional year you let the base sit is a year that base gets to multiply instead of merely add. Person B didn't out-earn person A, but they still built real wealth because they stopped waiting for a perfect moment and let time do what it does. Now here's something almost nobody talks about, and honestly it might be the most useful insight of all. The slow years aren't just necessary, they're doing the real work, even though it doesn't look that way. Picture compounding as a snowball rolling down a long hill. At the top, the slope is barely there. You're the one pushing the snowball yourself, and it picks up only a little snow at a time. Progress is genuinely slow, which is frustrating if you're expecting it to already be enormous. But here's what's actually happening at that stage. The snowball is establishing its shape. Its size at the bottom of the hill, the wild, dramatic part everyone pictures when they imagine compounding, is almost entirely determined by how much snow it gathered during that slow, unglamorous top section. Cut that top section short, and you don't just lose that section's growth. You shrink the base that everything afterward multiplies from. That's why quitting during the flat years costs so much more than it seems to in the moment. It isn't just I missed a few years of small growth. It's I permanently shrank the base that would have been compounding for every year that followed. There's a specific psychological trap tied to this, and plenty of people watching have probably felt it. Checking your account balance too often. When growth is small in dollar terms, checking daily or weekly shows you nothing but noise, market wiggles that dwarf the real underlying progress. That noise feels discouraging. It can even feel like proof that nothing's working. But you're measuring the wrong thing at the wrong resolution. Nobody judges whether a tree is growing by staring at the trunk for 10 minutes. You compare photos a year apart. Same idea here. The signal only becomes visible over a long enough window. The other trap is comparing your early years to someone else's later years. Social media doesn't help. You see someone post a portfolio that's ballooned, and you don't see the 15 boring years of loading that happened before the camera ever showed up. You're comparing your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. That comparison will always feel unfair. Because it is unfair, it isn't even the same chapter. Consider a retired school teacher who started contributing to a 403(b) at 26, put in a modest amount, every paycheck, for nearly 4 decades, and never once thought of herself as a serious investor. For the first 12 or 13 years, her statements looked almost identical to her own contributions, plus a little, unremarkable by her own account. But somewhere in her late 30s, without any change in her behavior, the growth line began separating from the contribution line. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. By the time she retired, the portfolio had grown to several multiples of everything she'd ever put in. Nothing dramatic happened in any single year. The drama, if you can call it that, was the accumulation of 13 quiet years nobody was watching. So practically, what do you actually do with all this? A few things, and none of them are complicated. First, if you're early in this process, stop judging your progress by comparing growth dollars to contribution dollars. That comparison will discourage you every single year until crossover, and crossover might be a decade away. Judge progress instead by whether you're contributing consistently and whether your investment mix suits your timeline. Consistency is the input you actually control. The output lags behind it on purpose. Second, know roughly where your own crossover point sits. You don't need a complicated model. A simple retirement calculator, based on your contribution rate and a reasonable return assumption, can show you approximately which year the math flips in your favor. For a lot of people starting from zero in their 20s or early 30s with disciplined contributions, that point tends to land somewhere in the 10 to 15 year range. Knowing that number matters because it turns an abstract someday into a concrete date you're working toward, which makes the boring years much easier to sit through. Third, and this one's underrated, resist the urge to ease off your contributions the moment growth starts looking exciting. Plenty of people reach their crossover point, watch the account genuinely start compounding faster, and use that as an excuse to pull back, assuming the portfolio's got it from here. It doesn't, not entirely. Contributions still matter after crossover. They just matter less than they did, because growth has taken over the heavier share of the lifting. Keep both engines running as long as you reasonably can. Fourth, if you're further along and you've already passed your crossover point, congratulations, genuinely. Fewer people reach it than you'd think, mostly because they stop before they get there. If that's you, this might be a good moment to revisit your asset allocation and think about protecting what you've built. Since the portfolio is now doing enough work that preserving the base matters just as much as growing it. One more thing worth mentioning, because it tends to get skipped in most versions of this conversation. Crossover isn't a finish line, and it definitely isn't permission to stop paying attention. Markets don't move in a straight line even after your growth outpaces your contributions. There will be years after crossover where the portfolio actually shrinks, sometimes significantly, and that can feel far more unsettling than the slow years ever did, precisely because you've grown used to watching it grow on its own. Understanding the math ahead of time doesn't make a down year comfortable. What it does is stop you from mistaking a down year for a broken plan. The mechanism that got you to crossover doesn't stop working during a rough stretch. It's still loading, still compounding beneath the surface, even in the years the chart is pointing the wrong way. So if there's one thing worth walking away with today, it's this. Compounding was never actually slow. It just spends its early years quietly building something you can't see yet. The flat stretch that makes people want to quit is the exact same stretch that makes the later years possible. You're not wasting time during those years. You're spending it on the one thing that can't be bought back later. Time itself, sitting inside the market. Working if you're a few years in and it still feels like nothing's happening, that discouragement makes sense. But nothing happening is the wrong way to describe it. Something is happening. It's just happening at a scale too small to notice yet, the same way you can't watch a snowball's shape change minute to minute at the top of the hill. Give it room. Give it time. Keep feeding it consistently. Because the version of this that eventually looks dramatic on a chart was built entirely out of years that felt completely undramatic while you were living through them. That's really the whole secret, if you can even call it one. There's no trick, no perfect fund, no timing strategy that gets you to the fast part any sooner than simply staying in long enough to reach it. The people who end up ahead usually aren't the ones who found something clever. They're the ones who didn't quit during the boring part. If you want more honest, no hype breakdowns like this one, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this kind of thing reach more people who need to hear it. And I'd love to know, roughly speaking, do you know where your own crossover point sits? Thanks for spending this time working through the numbers.